Hello. When people of faith are asked to defend their belief in a creator God, they often turn to the argument that there must be a first cause. You can't create something out of nothing. Therefore, right at the beginning, someone must have been responsible for the first element from which sprang life. A new book, A Universe from Nothing, written by the American theoretical physicist Lawrence Krauss, turns this argument on its head. Not only can something arise out of nothing, but something will always arise out of nothing. Physics tells us that nothingness is inherently unstable. It's mind-blowing stuff. It made an enormous impact in the States, making the New York Times bestsellers list. And it prompted Richard Dawkins to observe that it was potentially the most important scientific book with implications for atheism since Darwin. So does it knock the argument for God on the head? Are physics and God irreconcilable? Joining me to discuss whether physics leaves any place for God are Dr John Lennox, Professor of Mathematics at the University of Oxford, Dr Usama Hasan, Senior Lecturer at Middlesex University and a part-time Imam, and Dr Mark Vernon, Honorary Research Fellow at Birkbeck College, London, who has degrees in physics, theology and philosophy. So John, are God and physics incompatible?
I don't think so at all. And having looked at Lawrence Krauss's book, I think the title for the start is very misleading, because the nothing he claims that is a nothing is not actually a nothing. I don't think that the presentation of God or physics is a fair choice to offer people, because physics and God are not the same kind of explanation. Henry Ford and the laws of engineering and internal combustion are not alternative explanations for the motor car. They're different kinds of explanations in terms of agency on the one hand, Henry Ford, and on the other hand, the laws of internal combustion and engineering. That's explanation in terms of mechanism and law.
Usama, what does a Muslim think? Are God and physics incompatible?
No, of course not. Muslims have always understood everything to be created by God or caused by God, following precise, observable scientific laws which we can see. I would agree with John there that talking about nothing, there isn't a nothing because there is a quantum uncertainty principle on which this argument is based, which tells us that there's no such thing as a nothing, there's energy and matter and there's time, which can lead to particles appearing out of so-called nothing. But it's not a pure nothing because there is a law of physics there which needs to be explained. Where did that come from? And I find that my atheist or agnostic friends are never able to answer that question. Where do the fundamental laws of physics come from?
Mark, as I understand it, you're agnostic. So what's your view? Is God and physics incompatible?
They're not incompatible, but I think we have to work a bit to understand how they do relate, because they don't relate directly. I think that the atheist appeal to the Big Bang as if something can come out of nothing is as misguided as the believer that might say that the Big Bang proves the story of creation in Genesis. There's something a bit more subtle going on which we have to think about.
I want to look a little bit at the history of some of our great scientists and some of the big names that were well known and what sort of theological undergirding they had. Let's take Galileo first, and I choose him because he had a big conflict with the church. What was his worldview, Mark?
Galileo, I think, actually had his conflict with the church because he was part of the church. He too bought into many things which the church taught in the medieval period, and so I think it's actually makes more sense of the history to think of it as almost an internecine squabble thrown in with a good bit of personality clash. Galileo doesn't seem to have been the most easy person to get on with, so it's not that God, as it were, was being trounced by modern science. It was that within the milieu of the time, the science asked for theology to understand things in different ways, and Galileo, I think, thought that he was asking theology to change, not to just run away.
John, let's turn to mathematician Kepler, who I think once said the chief aim of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order which has been imposed on it by God. What do you make of that?
Well, it's the view I myself hold. I think the thing I find fascinating about all of this is the actual rise of science, when it happened and where it happened. And I'm very interested in C.S. Lewis's succinct formulation of Alfred North Whitehead's view of this. He says men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. Far from science and belief in God being incompatible, it was arguably belief in God that drove science.
Let's turn to Islam. Usama, because there was a huge medieval flowering period when Islam and science bloomed together, a wonderful period. And the central idea behind that flowering was that maths and physics give a clear idea of God.
The flowering of science actually began in Baghdad under the Abbasid caliphs. It was the Baghdad astronomers who measured the angle of the Earth's axis for the first time, for example. They studied the stars in great detail. They developed astronomy, medicine, mathematics. The words algebra and algorithm, logarithm, these are all from Arabic terms. And all the great Muslim scientists recognized what they were seeing was the beauty and wonder of God's handiwork. And in addition to what John has just said about looking for a lawgiver in nature, they were also inspired by the principle of unity, the idea of one God and therefore a unity in creation, all its interacting parts of nature, displaying a deeper unity. That was an idea which was very important in Islam and also certainly in medieval Christianity, I think.
Let's move on to the founders of modern physics and the great name Isaac Newton, who I think believed that the universe was held together by divine intervention, John.
Well, it's clear that he had a theistic belief and that he sensed that because God had created the universe, therefore one could actually do science. It seems to me Newton is immensely important as evidence for what we're talking about today, because when he discovered his law of gravitation, he didn't say, marvellous, now I understand how it works, I don't need God. It was the exact opposite. His response was, what a wonderful God he is who did it that way. And he wrote the Principia Mathematica, arguably the most famous book in the whole history of science, with the express wish that it would convince the thinking person to believe in God.
As I understand it, physics at the time of Newton was still known as natural philosophy or natural theology, but this has since changed, and bringing us very nearly up to the present, Usama, to the great scientists of the early 20th century, people like Einstein and Bohr and Heisenberg. I think it's very interesting that all of them had Jewish background. And I think even Einstein retained some sort of belief in a God.
Certainly Einstein did, although he had a very mystical view of religion. One very interesting conversation is when he met the great Indian poet and mystic Tagore. They discussed the nature of reality. And of course Einstein had just revolutionized our ideas, or discovered basic ideas about matter, energy, space and time, the building blocks of the physical universe, if you like. And Einstein is arguing from a position of transcendence, in other words, of reality, ultimate reality being beyond, whereas Tagore is talking about immanence and how the divine principles are everywhere around us, if you like. It's a very, very interesting conversation, but it's inspired clearly by their religious traditions. Einstein from the Jewish perspective, where transcendence, like in Islam, is very strong.
But the interesting thing, Mark, is that there is a fundamental difference between Einstein and the likes of Newton, because Newton began from a theological position. He had a belief in creation, and his science in some sense was informed by that, whereas with the 20th century scientists, they began with no preconditions. The science was everything. The science came first.
It might help to separate out the motivations that people have for doing science and then the way that science works itself. Science is an autonomous subject. It doesn't appeal to anything outside of itself, as it were, to do its everyday work. And now what brings people to do science is a different question entirely. It's a question of their psychology. For Newton, it seems to have been his great interest in other things. For Einstein, perhaps it was a more mystical Jewish past, which was part of his makeup. But science of itself doesn't, as it were, need to appeal to theological ideas. It certainly appeals to things like laws of nature, but of course you can then have different understandings of where the laws of nature come from. They needn't be theological, although some people might feel that they would be.
I guess, John, what I'm saying is that physics from the 20th century on is much more materialist.
Oh, it is indeed, and reductionist. The idea that everything can be in the end explained in terms of physics and chemistry. That idea I find utterly fascinating, because it seems to me to be essentially self-refuting. We mentioned Einstein, and I think one of the striking things about him is that he wondered at the fact that the universe was rationally intelligible. Now, every scientist, whether in the 16th or the 21st century, believes as a basic axiom that science can be done. They believe in the rational intelligibility of the universe. And what I found very interesting in the whole current debate is this, that the materialist view says that the mind that's doing the science is just the brain, and the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And philosophers today are seizing on this, that the very existence of the rational intelligibility of the universe is undermined. That is, the prerequisite for doing science is undermined by the dominant worldview of the academy. I find that really ironical.
Well, John, maybe I could just come in at that point because, of course, modern science does have quite a good account of a blind process that can produce very complex things, which, of course, is known as evolution. But also I think the other point there is that whether or not the universe is actually rational all the way down is something that science can't actually decide, because science comes to the universe looking for the rational bits, if you like, and it by that way sort of excludes the things that might not be rational. So science is bound, as it were, always to see rationality wherever it looks, but that's only because it's got rational glasses on, if you like, looking for those links.
Usama, theology asks a question, a fundamental question. What is all this for? What is life about? I wonder, is that a question that science thinks is outside its remit? And if you remove that question, then surely something big is missing.
You mean meaning?
Yes,
meaning
yes, absolutely.
Well, many scientists, of course, do comment on meaning and what is this all for. So, for example, a leading physicist like Michio Kaku in Hyperspace, at the end of his book, he said, well, perhaps this is why we're all here, so that we can be the observers of quantum phenomena. It's taken 15 billion years, almost, for conscious minds to evolve so that we can resolve a basic problem in quantum physics, which we still don't understand. And many physicists say that, or perhaps this is why we are here. Now, it's actually strikingly similar to what the religious people say, that we are here to do something noble with our consciousness, with our soul, with our mind, and that is to know God. So in a sense, scientists climb up a very difficult mountain to get to the top, and when they look for meaning, I think they find the mystic is already sitting there.
Let me remind you that you're listening to Beyond Belief, and today we're discussing physics and religion. When we explore the mechanics of the universe, is it possible to discern the signature of God? And with me are three people with an interest in both physics and theology: Mark Vernon, Usama Hasan and John Lennox. Graham Swinard spent most of his professional life studying physics and astrophysics from a purely secular perspective. Thoughts of God never entered into the equation. I asked him if he'd always been a bit of a boffin.
I can't remember a time when I wasn't interested. I think it was sparked by a primary school teacher, in the distant past. And my childhood hero was people like Albert Einstein, would you believe? Which is a bit strange, isn't it, really? A bit sad.
Was there ever a place in your science for God?
Not at all, no. I was of the view at that time that physics explained everything, that the universe was physics and there was no need for a God.
So how did the idea that there might be a creator first present itself to you?
Well, it was through this argument of fine-tuning of the constants, of the fundamental constants that govern the universe.
What does that mean?
It's an idea which is, I think, very nicely put by Martin Rees in his book, Just Six Numbers, that the fundamental laws, the constants of nature that govern the universe are finely tuned, so that we can be here. And if they were sort of slightly different, a few tenths of a percentage point, usually something of that kind of order, then we wouldn't be here. So this is giving a really hard edge, a sharpened edge to this notion of the anthropic principle, which of course has been with us for a very long time.
And this revelation came to you on a family holiday?
It did, yes. So we were having a rather nice, relaxing holiday in Guernsey, and I don't know why, but I just started to think about, this explosion of information that we've had about the universe through improved technology, observational technology, how it is refining this notion of fine-tuning, and it presented a kind of a conundrum for me. I thought, well, why is this? So I thought various options like the multiverse, this idea of many universes and we just happen to live in the right one, or maybe there was a creator and so on. And I kind of mulled those things over in my mind for a long time during that summer period.
And you thought that the likeliest explanation was that there was a creator. Now, that was a rational argument.
Yes, it was, really.
And it must have come as a bit of a shock to you. How did you feel about those thoughts, having lived as a sort of secular scientist for 40 years?
Well, it was an uncomfortable thing, really. If I look back, I would probably speak in words these days by saying something like it was some kind of intervention by the Holy Spirit in terms of guiding me through this stuff and making me look at it in a different way. But that's the way I would think now. Those kind of words were not in my vocabulary in those days.
But they are now, because your experience has moved on and you attended an Alpha course, and that basically turned your life around.
Yes, it did. Yes, I felt I had an encounter with God, with the Holy Spirit on that occasion. It was a real thing for me. It was a very unwelcome thing for me because it was an affront to my philosophy of life. But I guess if you feel God's placed a hand on your shoulder, the creator of the universe, then you've got to take note, and it changes your life.
If in 10 years' time someone came along with a new theory of everything that explained creation and did away with the idea of God, do you think that would make you change your mind?
Well, I think those two things are a little different. The idea of coming up with a theory of everything and the idea of explaining away God. I do feel that science and religion, science, faith, science and God, whichever way you want to express it, they're in harmony in my view. But to get to the question, I still have this precious experience, this experiential evidence, if you like, of God, and I can't disregard that. Even if some clever guy comes up with a theory of everything, explains all the fine-tuning and all that, nevertheless I still cannot disregard my experience of God.
That was Graham Swinnard. And Mark, he talked of the anthropic principle, the fine-tuning of the universe, which, as I understand it, means that if the conditions of the Big Bang had been fractionally different, fractionally to a minuscule degree, we could not have come into being. Does that argument wash with you?
It doesn't, but it is impressive. It is possible, for example, to propose an infinite universe or a multiverse, and of course we would live in the bit that's tuned right for life, by definition. Similarly, you can appeal to God and say God somehow tuned the universe. Actually, I think that understanding for a theologian is not very appealing, really, because it feels a bit God of the gap-ish, this idea that God doesn't do a whole lot, but just every so often tinkers a bit here and there. And that's not actually a very convincing idea of the God who, well, certainly the Christian God, who knows and loves his people. A tinkering God doesn't really stack up, I don't think.
John?
I think it is very impressive, the argument for fine-tuning. The multiverse notion, which is, of course, rejected by many leading physicists.
We maybe better explain the multiverse theory, John.
The multiverse is the idea that there is an infinite number of universes, and essentially everything that can happen does happen in one universe. So you shouldn't be surprised that you find yourself in a universe like this, because this is the only kind of universe you can find yourself in. Well, it seems to me that the multiverse theory is being very much overused. And I find myself that since these other universes are not even accessible and their existence is very questionable, a far more reasonable hypothesis is to believe in one God who designed this universe to be capable of supporting life. So I find that these fine-tuning evidences, and some of them are extremely impressive, they do form a very plausible and a very powerful, to my mind, pointer towards God. They're not a mathematical proof, of course, of the existence of God, but they are evidence for the existence of God.
Usama?
I agree. The fine-tuning argument is very impressive if you just study the physics and the mathematics of it. But I think we do have to look at objections to that, such as the idea that we've won the cosmic lottery, so of course we're impressed by that. That's basically what it boils down to. But I'd like to ask Mark, do you think the multiverse theory is actually scientific? Because if the other universes are not accessible, I know people are talking about indirect experimental tests for other universes, but it's really, really very far-fetched. And therefore we cannot actually set up an experimental test for the other universes, and we probably can't falsify them. And therefore, surely the multiverse theory does not count as a scientific theory. And is it true then that, as one physicist put it, that the multiverse theory is the last resort of the desperate atheist?
Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I don't particularly find the multiverse theory convincing either. My only point is that I don't think that theologians should leap very hard on the fine-tuning too, because of what it says about God. I think it was very interesting in Graham's interview there that it was a personal thing that changed him, actually. It was going on the Alpha course and the encounter with the Holy Spirit. And then he sees his science in a different way. I think that's how it works, actually, that it's the personal element that counts. It's a bit perhaps like music. If you played some music in a sounds laboratory, the scientists there might be able to tell you all sorts of things about the music, but to know about the meaning of the music, you would play it in a concert hall and see how an audience responded.
Usama.
I think he's absolutely right that faith is largely to do with experience, although because we live in a rational universe, faith must also be on a rational basis, or must not be anti-rational or irrational. And certainly the classical Islamic theologians like Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah came to the conclusion that you could not prove the existence of God logically. You could provide arguments which showed it was a fair thing, a plausible thing to believe, but in the end, faith in God was something intuitive and based on experience. And I think that's very true about the nature of religion and faith in the modern world.
Well, one of the great challenges, it seems to me, to people of faith is the challenge that science poses to the idea that humankind is at the centre of the universe, that creation culminates with us, Mark.
I don't have particularly a problem with that. If you're thinking about things like consciousness, and particularly self-consciousness, if you cut the universe, as it were, in a kind of psychological way, then human beings, as far as we know, are the most significant objects, if you like, in the universe because of this self-awareness. I think actually that modern science bigs humanity up perhaps more than old-style religion would, which would tell us that there are entities higher than humanity, like the angels and, of course, like God himself.
But John, if all this had to happen so that humankind could come to live on Earth, that all this enormous multiple universes had to happen, it seems to be a very wasteful process.
It may seem like that to you, but actually it shows that human beings are immensely important. And I would agree with Mark here that geometry or size is not the measure of importance. Sometimes I wonder if God thinks logarithmically, because after all, if you look at a logarithmic scale, human beings are about halfway between the size of an atom and the size of the observable universe. I do feel with Mark that the existence of consciousness, the sun is much bigger than me. I know it's there, it doesn't know I'm here. There's a vast gulf between me and it. So thinking simply in terms of size and geometry is to really miss the whole point of what's going on here.
We simply don't have time to cover all the things I would love to cover in this programme, but I would, in the little time we've got left, just like to discuss some of the similarities between the practice of physics and the practice of theology. It seems to me, Usama, that doubt and uncertainty are part of both, as are faith. The scientist has to live with doubt, and the believer has to live with doubt.
Yes, there are similarities, and it helps to enrich our practice of science and religion to think about those similarities, because, of course, scientists believe that there is this rational order and that everything follows those precise laws which we know so much about, but they still have to believe that it will continue to do so. We base our scientific experiments on a kind of faith that they will continue as they are, but we adjust our theories in the light of evidence. And I think it's very important also for believers to adjust their notions based on empirical evidence and not stick too rigidly to dogmas which may be more cultural. All of the negative aspects of religion, if you like, cultural problems, misuse of faith and religion, is all to do with people focusing on secondary matters and not applying doubt and humility, which I think is also required in science.
John, I'm sure that rings bells with you, because a lot of the problems for scientific believers like you are caused when believers get stuck on what they think is an article of faith. I'm thinking of creationists and people who deny evolution, which causes immense problems.
That's absolutely true, but I think it's worth emphasising this matter of faith because there's widespread confusion about it, because the movement known as the New Atheists has done a very good job in convincing the public that faith is believing where there is no evidence, and therefore it is a peculiarly religious phenomenon and has nothing to do with science. And I agree very much with Usama in emphasising that science is faith-based. Science involves faith. And we trust that our science is done on the basis of evidence, so it becomes evidence-based faith. What I think is enormously important to see that it's exactly the same in the question of, say, my Christian faith. I believe in God. It is a commitment based on evidence.
Mark?
I would like to perhaps just bring it back to the personal element too here, because I think that the scientific way of life is quite like a monastic way of life. I remember when I did my cosmology, I had to do things like get up in the middle of the night when all was still, and it felt a bit like one of those monks that gets up in the middle of the night to say an office.
It seems to me, Usama, that there are more physicists who are believers than there are biologists. Do you think that's true?
It may well be true, and certainly some of the leading physicists like Einstein and Dirac had religious views, usually mystical. Now, mysticism is looking at the inner side of religion, if you like, the ultimate truth. And I think that's very interesting because 20th century physics can point towards mysticism, especially quantum theory, which shows that there is this basic uncertainty in the very foundation of the physical universe. And that fits well with mysticism, which looks at religious paradoxes, if you like, such as God's omniscience, God's knowing everything versus free will. And there are these paradoxes in religion also, which sometimes the mystics say, you have to feel and kind of step beyond, you can't resolve them logically. And it's a bit like that with quantum theory.
Mark?
I wonder whether this business about biologists being more vociferous atheists has to do with the fact that biology's had really quite a good run for the last 150 years, ever since Darwin wrote his great book, and whereas physicists have actually seen their theories challenged even a couple of times in people's own lifetimes. When I did my physics in the 1980s, string theory, for example, wasn't even thought of, and multiverses weren't either, but now they're fairly current. And so physics has a bit of humility, knowing that its discipline can be turned around really very fast, and perhaps biologists need to be aware of that.
All three of you have spent extended periods of your lives considering the universe from a theological and a physics perspective. If you had to define what the purpose of the universe is, what would you say, Usama?
The universe is here to declare the glory of God and also to produce beings, conscious beings, who are able to think and look at the evidence and decide for themselves whether or not there is a God, and whether we choose good or evil, and ultimately to choose to know, love and worship God. That's the meaning behind the existence of the universe.
Mark?
I'm not sure whether I would be able to say the universe as a whole has a purpose, but perhaps the universe is a container for people like ourselves, and maybe we're not the only ones, who do have purposes to do with flourishing, to do with curiosity, and to do with love.
John?
The universe is a temporary home for human beings created in the image of God. He's conveyed on us that immense dignity. And ultimately, for me, the whole purpose of life in the universe is to enjoy the fellowship of the Creator that invented the atom.
Well, that's it, not just for this programme, but for this series of Beyond Belief. My thanks to Mark Vernon, John Lennox and Usama Hasan. I'll be back later in the year with another series of Beyond Belief. Until then, goodbye.